A cold case, 400 years old. The victim, one of the most powerful women in history. The cause of her demise, officially unknown. For centuries, we only had rumors. But now, detectives have their first real clue.
Over the past year, historians have been piecing together clues about its origins and discovered that this piece of cloth was once part of a skirt that belonged to Queen Elizabeth I.
The Queen's own DNA lifted from a scrap of her clothing. This genetic witness is finally talking. It's pointing to a hidden medical condition, a slow-acting internal enemy that explains her strange behavior, her reliance on toxic makeup, and the horrifying secret her doctors were forbidden from ever discovering. The Code of a Queen. For over 400 years, the story of Queen Elizabeth I's final days was a bizarre mix of political spin and campfire horror stories. The official narrative was that she passed away from a profound grief, a broken heart. But the rumors whispered in the shadows were far darker. They spoke of a queen descending into madness, of a body that swelled and burst inside its coffin, and of secrets so deep they were forbidden from being investigated. So here's the deal. For centuries, there was no way to prove any of it. It was just one person's word against another. That all changed with the rediscovery of a single forgotten object. For centuries, it hung in a quiet church in a small English village, mistaken for a simple altar cloth. But experts eventually realized what it was: a piece of a 16th century royal skirt exquisitely embroidered with silver thread. And get this, detailed analysis proved it was the only known surviving piece of clothing worn by Elizabeth I herself. This wasn't just a historical treasure, it was a biological one. In a clean room lab, forensic scientists began a painstaking process examining the ancient threads, fiber by fiber. What most people don't realize is that fabrics this old can trap microscopic traces of the person who wore them. Skin cells, sweat, maybe even a drop of blood. And after months of work, they found it. A few degraded cells, preserved for over 4 centuries. It was just enough. Using cutting-edge technology, they managed to sequence fragments of the Queen's DNA. This was the moment history held its breath. The genetic code of one of the most powerful and mysterious rulers of all time was finally readable. Everyone expected to find, well, nobody knew what to expect. But what they found was a bombshell. The DNA didn't point to an assassin's poison, it pointed to something inside her, a genetic vulnerability she was born with. The analysis revealed 2 critical factors. First, she had genetic markers for a hypersensitive immune system, a predisposition for what modern doctors would call an autoimmune disorder. This meant her body's own defenses were primed to overreact. Second, and this is the crazy part, she had a specific genetic variation that made her body terrible at processing heavy metals, specifically lead and mercury. Suddenly, 400 years of rumors started to make terrifying sense. This genetic blueprint was the key. It suggested the Queen's entire life was a medical ticking clock. It wasn't just one thing that led to her end. It was a perfect storm of genetics, tragedy, and the one thing she was most famous for. This DNA discovery was so profound that it launched a brand new investigation, a virtual autopsy led by top pathologists, to piece together how these genetic clues matched the eyewitness accounts of her horrifying decline. The DNA provided the map. Her life and her famous mask was the crime scene. This genetic key also threw a massive wrench into one of the wildest theories about Elizabeth ever cooked up. It's a conspiracy theory that has persisted for centuries, known as the Bisley Boy legend. The story goes like this. When Elizabeth was a young princess, she was sent to the village of Bisley to escape the plague in London. While there, she supposedly got sick and suddenly passed away. Her governess, terrified of what King Henry VIII would do, panicked. In a desperate move, she found a local boy from the village who looked remarkably like Elizabeth, put him in her clothes, and presented him to the king as the real princess. According to this theory, this boy is the person who went on to rule England for 45 years. Proponents of this theory point to all the clues. Why did Elizabeth never marry? Why did she famously tell Parliament she had the heart and stomach of a king? Why was she completely bald and reliant on wigs? Why did she absolutely refuse to let doctors examine her body even on her deathbed? It sounds completely insane, right? But for centuries, it was a persistent whisper. This new DNA evidence, however, was a chance to finally put the theory to rest. The scientists tested the DNA for a Y chromosome, and the result? The DNA was 100% female. The Bisley boy legend was officially debunked. But here's the catch. The debunking of one mystery only made the real mystery even deeper. The DNA was female, but it was the DNA of a female who was, as her genes showed, uniquely vulnerable. It confirmed she was a woman, but it also told us why her life and her passing were so strange. Her refusal to be examined wasn't about hiding her gender, it was about hiding her decay. Her body was her kingdom's greatest secret, and that secret was rooted in her very blood. The DNA told scientists what she was vulnerable to. The next step was to figure out if she was exposed to it, and that led them directly to her most iconic feature, her face. Her famous mask was not just a mask, it was a cage, the price of perfection. To understand the tragedy of Queen Elizabeth I, you have to understand the world she lived in. It was, putting it lightly, a man's world. Kings had armies, they had physical intimidation. They had the simple fact of their gender on their side. Elizabeth had none of that. She came to the throne at 25, a young woman surrounded by older, powerful men who saw her as weak and illegitimate. She knew from day one that to survive, she couldn't just rule, she had to perform. So she created a character, the Virgin Queen. She was married not to a man, but to her kingdom. She was pure, untouchable, and most importantly, ageless. She had to project an image of divine, semi-mythical power. And at first this was easy. She was young, vibrant, and celebrated for her striking red hair. Then, in 1562, disaster struck. A vicious bout of smallpox nearly ended her life. She was so close to the end that her council was already making plans for her succession. She survived, but the disease was brutal, leaving her face permanently scarred. For any normal person, this would be a tragedy. For Elizabeth, it was a political crisis. Her divine image was shattered. She was now visibly damaged. But here's the catch. Elizabeth didn't just accept it. She decided to erase it. This is where her infamous mask of youth was born. She turned to a cosmetic paste called Venetian ceruse. It sounds fancy, but it was a toxic cocktail of white lead and vinegar. She would layer it on her face, her neck, and her hands, creating a ghostly white complexion that was, according to some, inches thick. In the 16th century, pale skin was the ultimate status symbol. It meant you didn't toil in the sun, you were elite. But for Elizabeth, it was so much more. This white mask erased her smallpox scars. It erased any sign of age, weariness, or human imperfection. In public, she appeared as a living statue, ageless, a supernatural figure who was above the decay of normal life. And remember that DNA discovery? That specific, terrible vulnerability to heavy metals? The very armor she chose to save her reign was the exact substance her body was genetically incapable of fighting. Every single day, for over 40 years, the toxic lead was seeping into her skin, silently attacking her from the inside. What most people don't realize is that the lead was just the start of the toxic nightmare. To get that perfectly pale, divine look, Venetian ceruse was often improved with other ingredients. We're talking about small, steady doses of arsenic, which was known to give the skin a fashionably pale, wan look. And for her iconic red lips, the most common pigment used was cinnabar. The chemical name for cinnabar is mercury sulfide. So let's just recap. Every single day, the queen was slathering her face with a cocktail of lead to make her skin white, mercury to make her lips red, arsenic to clear her complexion. She was applying 3 of the most potent neurotoxins known to mankind, and her own DNA was screaming that she couldn't process any of them. The effects were catastrophic. The lead poisoning is what caused her hair to fall out in clumps. Her iconic red hair? For most of her reign, it was a wig. She reportedly owned over 80 different wigs to maintain the illusion of her youth. The lead also began to corrode her skin underneath, creating a grayish, scarred pallor that meant she needed to apply more makeup to cover the very damage the makeup was causing. It was a vicious cycle. The mercury, meanwhile, began to attack her nerves. This could explain the tremors in her hands that courtiers noted in her later years. And the arsenic? That would have been slowly destroying her digestive system. This has led to another wild theory. We all assume she did this to herself. But what if she had help? This is the slow poison plot. Think about it. Her closest companion for decades was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Dudley's first wife had passed away under, let's say, mysterious circumstances. Falling down a short flight of stairs, Dudley himself was known as an expert in poisons and potions. Is it really so crazy to think that he might have encouraged the Queen's use of these cosmetics? Maybe he even supplied her with special mixtures. He knew that as long as she was reliant on the makeup, she was reliant on him to protect her image. It would have been the perfect long-con power play, a way to keep her isolated and dependent. She was the most powerful woman in the world, but she was also, potentially, the victim of a 40-year-long domestic poisoning. Her control over this image was absolute. In an era without photographs, royal portraits were propaganda, and Elizabeth was obsessed. In 1596, she issued a royal decree that shocks historians even today. She ordered all unflattering portraits of her to be found and destroyed. Artists were given approved face patterns to work from, ensuring the Queen's public face never aged a day. This wasn't just vanity. This was national security. Think about it. Her greatest rival, King Philip II of Spain, was always looking for a weakness. If he saw portraits of her as an old, sick, scarred woman, he might see a kingdom that was ripe for invasion. The mask of youth wasn't for her, it was for him. It was a weapon of war, a piece of propaganda that helped keep the Spanish Armada at bay. What most people don't realize is the cost of this illusion. The lead, mercury, and arsenic were building up in her system. Her body was keeping a terrible score. She had successfully created an immortal queen, a powerful myth that held her kingdom together. But underneath the paint and the pageantry, the real woman was being eaten alive by her own armor. Her image was a masterpiece, but her body was already failing. The tyranny of grief. As Elizabeth approached her 70th year, the magnificent illusion she had so carefully maintained for a lifetime began to crumble. To her people, she was still Gloriana, the queen who had faced down the mighty Spanish Armada and ushered in a golden age. She was a living legend. Yeah, about that. Behind the palace walls, the queen was disappearing. She was physically frail, mentally exhausted, and haunted by a profound sense of loss that no amount of power could fix. The crazy part is, the world she knew had simply vanished. Most of her trusted friends and advisors were gone. William Cecil, her steadfast chief minister for 40 years, had passed away. Her spy master, Francis Walsingham, was long gone. The loss of her ladies-in-waiting, women who had been her companions since girlhood, left her devastatingly alone. But the ghost that loomed largest was that of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. He had been her brilliant, reckless favorite, a man she had adored, but his ambition got the better of him. In 1601, he led a foolish, failed rebellion against her. Elizabeth, the Queen, had no choice but to sign his execution warrant. The final punishment of Essex was an act of state, but for Elizabeth, the woman, it was a wound that would never heal. Sir Robert Carey, her cousin, wrote that in her final year, the Queen would sit in darkened rooms weeping over Essex's fate. She was also heard murmuring her regret over the execution of her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, an event that had taken place nearly 2 decades earlier. The iron-willed monarch was now drowning in a sea of grief. This emotional collapse triggered a shocking physical decline. What many overlooked is that her legendary sweet tooth had finally caught up with her. In the Elizabethan age, sugar was a new, incredibly expensive luxury, a status symbol just like her white skin. Elizabeth ate massive amounts of it. The combination of sugar, a lack of dental care, and the poisons in her system was catastrophic. Courtiers wrote that her teeth had decayed into blackened stumps. They were so rotted that foreign ambassadors complained they couldn't understand her when she spoke. These blackened stumps weren't just a cosmetic problem. Her gums were riddled with painful abscesses. We're talking about deep rotting infections in her jaw. It became agonizing for her to eat or speak. And get this, in a time before antibiotics, that infection doesn't just stay in your mouth. It seeps into the bloodstream, a slow, invisible poison of its own. And then there was the other poison, Decades of applying lead-based ceruse to her face had taken a terrible toll, especially on her genetically vulnerable body. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Sores erupted on her body. She was in a state of constant fatigue. Chronic lead poisoning was slowly shutting down her systems, attacking her nerves and organs. To put it mildly, her behavior became alarming. The once vibrant and witty queen fell into long periods of silence, refusing to speak for days on end. She rejected her doctors, swatting away any attempts to help her. She stopped allowing her ladies-in-waiting to bathe or dress her. But the strangest, most terrifying detail was this. In her final weeks, she refused to go to bed. Instead, she spent hours, sometimes more than 15 hours a day, standing or sitting motionless on cushions piled on the floor. Her attendants believed she was terrified. Terrified that if she lay down, if she went to sleep, she would never get up again. But the wilder theory suggests something even stranger. The combination of lead, mercury, and arsenic poisoning is a known cause of vivid, terrifying hallucinations. These whispers suggest the queen wasn't just afraid of not waking up, she was afraid of what she saw when she closed her eyes. She was, according to these accounts, being haunted. She would point to empty corners of the room and hiss, claiming she saw the ghost of Essex or even her executed mother, Anne Boleyn. This has been linked to another shadowy figure in her life, John Dee. Dee was her court astrologer and many believe an occult practitioner. He was the one who chose her coronation date based on the stars. Some fringe theories claim that Elizabeth and Dee were involved in rituals and that her mask of youth was more than just makeup. It was part of a ritual to maintain her power. In her final days, these theories argue the ritual failed. The heavy metal poisoning wasn't just a medical issue, it was a spiritual one, opening a door that allowed these ghosts to torment her. It's a bizarre idea, but it's one way that people at the time tried to explain her terrifying, unhinged behavior. The most heartbreaking and most telling detail from her final days concerns her coronation ring. She had worn it for 45 years as a symbol of her marriage to her kingdom. As her health failed, her body began to swell up. This was edema, a classic sign of massive organ failure. Her kidneys, ravaged by decades of lead and sepsis, were shutting down. Her body was filling with fluid, and the ring began to cut deep into the flesh of her finger. It became so embedded, so tight, that it was literally growing into her. Her doctors had no choice. They had to file the ring off her finger. For Elizabeth, this was the ultimate violation. The symbol of her entire life, her power, her marriage, was being violently cut away. The mask of youth had shattered, revealing a woman consumed by pain, both physical and emotional. She was a prisoner in her own failing body. The queen was fading, and her body was sending terrifying signals. The truth in the tomb. In the cold, damp days of March 1603, Richmond Palace became a place of hushed whispers and fearful glances. Queen Elizabeth, the immovable center of the English world for 45 years, was clearly in her final decline. The entire court was in a state of suspended animation, walking on eggshells. Every courtier, every politician, every servant knew the end was near, but the queen herself refused to admit it. And that's what made it so terrifying. Yet her terrifying willpower remained. She refused to name a successor. She refused to acknowledge her own mortality. In doing so, she held her entire court and the future of the nation hostage to her silence. For weeks, she had been standing or sitting on cushions, refusing to go to bed, convinced that if she lay down, she would never rise again. Her mind was, by all accounts, wandering, plagued by the very real ghosts of her past. On March 24th at around 2 a.m, the end finally came. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, was kneeling by her side, pleading with her to give some sign, any sign of her faith and her choice for the throne. She was long past speaking, but as he named James VI of Scotland, some in the room claimed they saw her make a faint gesture, a slight touch of her hand to her head as if to signal the crown. And then she was gone. The Queen passed away. But she didn't go with a final command or a poignant last word. After a lifetime of magnificent speeches and iron-fisted control, she passed in a profound and unsettling silence. And here's the deal. In one of her last acts of control, she had strictly forbidden a post-mortem examination. Her body was to remain a mystery. Think about that. Why? Why would a monarch whose entire life was public property forbid the one thing that could confirm her cause of passing? Was she terrified of the world finally seeing the smallpox scars she had hidden for 40 years? Was it the blackened stumps of her teeth, the sores and lesions on her skin from the constant poisoning, the truth of her ruined body? Yeah, about that it was all of an answer. Her entire 45-year reign was a performance, a masterpiece of image control. She had built the myth of Gloriana, the ageless virgin queen. A post-mortem would have been the final ugly curtain call, revealing the rotting human truth beneath the divine makeup. She would not allow it. This is where the final and perhaps most important conspiracy theory comes in, the grief cover-up. Her inner circle, led by her brilliant hunchback spymaster Robert Cecil, was in a full-blown panic. The throne had no officially named heir, even if the gesture to James was real. The Spanish were still a threat. The kingdom was unstable. They needed a smooth, fast transition of power to James VI of Scotland. And the truth of Elizabeth's end was, well, it was bad for business. Think about the real story. The Queen of England hadn't just passed away. She had spent 40 years slowly poisoning herself with her own vanity and imagecraft. She had quite literally rotted from the inside out. Her teeth were gone, her hair was gone, her mind was gone, and her body was a swollen, septic, ravaged wreck. You can't tell the people that. You can't tell the world that. A divine queen, a semi-mythical figure can't just rot. So they invented a more poetic, more noble story, a story that protected the Tudor myth. Robert Cecil, a pragmatist to his core, likely made the call. He initiated a brilliant piece of political spin. Imagine the scene, a darkened room in Richmond Palace, the Queen's body lying cold in the next chamber, and her closest advisors crafting the official story. They couldn't say it was poison. They couldn't say it was infection from her own mouth. Instead, they told the world she passed away from a broken heart, a profound melancholy brought on by the loss of her dearest friend and one-time rebel, the Earl of Essex. It was perfect. It made her human, but still mythic. It was tragic, but not disgusting. It was a love story, not a medical horror show. And it's the story that, for the most part, our history books still repeat. The real gruesome truth was locked away. The new king, James I, needed a stable kingdom. He had no interest in digging up the truth about his predecessor. He buried Elizabeth in Westminster Abbey, and the secret was buried with her. But the secret, apparently, didn't want to stay buried. This brings us back to one of the most gruesome and most believable of the wild theories, the exploding casket. The rumor came from one of her own ladies-in-waiting, a woman named Elizabeth Southwell. Southwell, who later converted to Catholicism, wrote a shocking account of the Queen's final days and what happened after. She claimed that weeks after the Queen was entombed, her body, which had been sealed in a lead-lined coffin to contain the decay, burst open. Southwell wrote that the body was bloated with foul humors, and that the gases from her decomposition built up to such an extent that the coffin exploded. The explosion was supposedly so violent that it released a noxious vapor that spread through the church. For centuries, this was dismissed as nasty Catholic propaganda, a gruesome tale designed to tarnish the legacy of the great Protestant Queen.
But what most people don't realize is that modern science has a name for this: exploding casket syndrome. It's a real, though rare, event. When a body is sealed in an airtight container like a lead-lined coffin, the natural gases from decomposition, methane, sulfur dioxide, and others, can't escape. The lead coffin becomes a pressure cooker. The body bloats, the pressure builds and ups until it ruptures. And the foul humors Southwell mentioned? That was the sepsis. That was the advanced organ failure. Her body was already in an advanced state of decay before she even passed. The swelling from her failing kidneys, the systemic infection from her mouth, it all created the perfect, horrifying conditions for this to happen. Elizabeth Southwell's story, as shocking as it is, might not have been propaganda at all. It might have been a grim, forensic observation. So for 400 years, all these stories, Cecil's grief spin, Southwell's exploding casket horror, were all just competing theories. All anyone could do was guess. Until now. That DNA discovery, the one made from the only surviving piece of her clothing, provided the clues. It revealed her genetic vulnerabilities, and it prompted a team of modern experts to conduct the one thing Elizabeth forbade, an autopsy. Led by Home Office pathologist Dr. Brett Locker and brilliant biological anthropologist Professor Alice Roberts, the team on Sky History's Royal Autopsy treated her passing as if it were a brand new case. Using all the historical accounts, the DNA evidence, and modern forensics, they built a virtual body and finally solved the mystery. Dr. Locker began with her mouth. He confirmed what the ambassadors had whispered. The dental condition was appalling. The blackened stumps were just the tip of the iceberg. The abscesses were likely deep, rotting her jaw from within. His grim conclusion, bacteria from those abscesses had invaded her bloodstream, triggering what modern medicine calls sepsis. It's a slow, invisible, systematic infection that was far beyond Tudor understanding. It poisons the blood, attacks the organs, and causes high fevers and delirium. This alone could have been the final blow. Then, Professor Roberts examined the makeup. The lab results on Venetian ceruse confirmed it was a slow-acting toxin. She connected the dots. The lead poisoning explained the hair loss, the fatigue, the mood swings, and the memory problems. It was destroying her from within, and her genes proved she had no defense against it. So here's the final verdict. The thing they never taught you in school. School teaches us she passed away from old age or a broken heart over Essex. The truth, revealed by her own DNA, is so much more horrifying. It wasn't one single thing. It was a cascade failure. And it all started with her genes. Think of it like this. First, the DNA showed she was uniquely vulnerable to heavy metals. Second, the smallpox scarred her face, forcing her to seek a solution. Third, that solution was lead-based makeup, a poison her body was genetically incapable of processing. Fourth, for 40 years that lead built up, destroying her hair and weakening her immune system. Fifth, at the same time, her massive sugar habit rotted her teeth, creating deep, pus-filled abscesses. Sixth, her immune system, already ravaged by lead, couldn't fight the infection. It became sepsis, poisoning her entire bloodstream. Seventh, her organs, especially her kidneys, began to fail from this combined toxic load. This caused the massive swelling that made her coronation ring cut into her finger. Eighth, the lead in her brain, combined with the high fever from the sepsis, almost certainly caused the hallucinations and madness that made her refuse to sleep for days on end, and the grief over Essex. It wasn't the cause. It was just the final trigger. It was the emotional stress that pushed her already poisoned, septic, and failing body over the edge. The legend of Queen Elizabeth will live forever, but now we know the devastating human cost. Was her incredible strength also her greatest weakness? Let us know. Don't forget to like and subscribe.